My name is Belinda, and I was 20 when my father decided my future was less important than my sister's business. It happened quietly, the way decisions that change your life often do. No shouting, no long explanations. Just a sentence delivered like a fact that had already been settled somewhere without me. My tuition money, the one thing that was supposed to carry me out of that house, was gone. He said her business needed it more. I remember standing there listening, realizing I wasn't being asked to agree. I was being informed. College was a plan I had built for years, step by step, assuming the promise would hold. That morning, I understood something else instead. I was the flexible one, the one who could wait, the one expected to adjust. I didn't argue, I didn't cry, I didn't try to convince him. What shocked me most wasn't the decision itself, but how normal it sounded when he said it, like shifting money from one account to another, like my future was just a line item that could be moved. That was the moment something inside me shut down. Not in a dramatic way, more like a door closing without noise. I walked out soon after, not knowing exactly where I was going or how long I could last on my own. I only knew I wasn't staying where my plans could be erased that easily. I didn't make a speech. I didn't threaten to cut anyone off. I just left. At the time, I thought walking away was the hardest part. I didn't know that months later my phone would light up again and again, unanswered, with calls I never expected to receive. And I definitely didn't know how expensive that one decision would become, for all of us. Before I tell you what he said, and what happened after I walked out, tell me, what time is it for you right now, and where are you watching from? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. A few hours later, the house settled into its usual quiet rhythm. What followed was not a dramatic confrontation, but a series of small moments that made the decision feel permanent. I watched my plans dissolve in real time, not through raised voices or slammed doors, but through logistics, bank transfers, emails that stopped coming, a calendar I had built around one assumption that no longer existed. My father framed everything as practical. He spoke in terms of timing, opportunity, and responsibility, as if those words could smooth out the imbalance of it all. I noticed how often the language shifted away from me. The conversation was never about what I had prepared for or what I was losing. It revolved around what was needed, what made sense, what the family had to prioritize. Somewhere in that framing, I disappeared. My sister's business was presented as fragile but promising, something that needed reinforcement right now. Mine, by contrast, was described as flexible. I could wait. I could adjust. I could figure something else out. No one said those words outright, but they hovered in the air, shaping every explanation. I realized then that reliability can become a liability when it's mistaken for endless tolerance. I began to understand my role in the family structure. I wasn't the risk taker or the investment. I was the buffer. The person expected to absorb impact so others could move faster. It had always been that way in smaller forms. This time, the scale was just larger. There was no formal announcement to extended family, no discussion about alternatives, no suggestion that this was temporary. Once the decision was set, it moved forward with the momentum of something that had already been justified. I stopped asking questions because the answers kept circling back to the same place. It wasn't about fairness. It was about convenience. Over the next few days, the house felt different to me. Not colder, but less solid. Every room carried reminders of a future I was no longer stepping into. Boxes I had packed stayed sealed. Lists I had written became irrelevant. I caught myself calculating costs out of habit, then remembering there was nothing left to calculate against. What unsettled me most was how quickly everyone else adjusted. Meals continued. Conversations drifted to other topics. Laughter returned to the table. The absence of urgency told me everything I needed to know about where my plans ranked. The decision had resolved a problem for them. For me, it had created one. I thought about pushing back harder, about demanding explanations that went beyond general principles. But the more I replayed the logic being used, the clearer it became that resistance would only reposition me as difficult. I had already been cast as adaptable. Protesting that role would make me the disruption. That realization shifted something in me. I stopped trying to be understood and started paying attention instead. I listened to how money was discussed, how risk was minimized when it wasn't personal, how optimism was extended unevenly. It wasn't malicious, it was structural. By the end of that week, I had quietly accepted that staying meant shrinking. It meant negotiating for pieces of a future I had already earned the right to pursue. I didn't want to spend years proving I deserved what had once been promised. So I began to prepare in ways no one noticed. I reduced what I needed. I looked for work that didn't depend on recommendations. I measured my options against one requirement only: independence. The idea wasn't escape, it was separation. I didn't tell anyone what I was planning because I wasn't planning anything elaborate. I was responding to a pattern that had finally revealed itself at full scale. The decision to redirect my tuition had clarified something essential. As long as I stayed, my goals would remain conditional. Leaving wouldn't fix what had already happened, but it would prevent it from happening again. A few days later, I was no longer living there. Leaving didn't feel dramatic. It felt procedural. I packed only what I could carry without help, not because I was trying to make a point, but because I wanted the exit to be clean. No announcements, no explanations. I understood by then that clarity didn't come from speeches. It came from action. I moved into a part of town most people only passed through. Rows of low buildings stretched along cracked service roads, metal doors marked with faded numbers, trucks arriving before sunrise and leaving without ceremony. The warehouse district sat just far enough from everything familiar to feel separate, but close enough to function. It wasn't temporary housing in the way people imagine it. It was a place where work happened, quietly and constantly. The job I found there wasn't connected to anyone I knew. That mattered. I worked long shifts handling inventory, tracking shipments, learning the rhythm of a system that ran on accuracy instead of optimism. There were no promises about advancement, no talk of potential, only clear expectations and consequences. I found comfort in that. My days became predictable in a way my life hadn't been for months. I woke up early, ate whatever was cheap and filling, and left before the streets filled with traffic. The work was physical enough to keep my thoughts focused. By the end of each shift, exhaustion replaced the constant mental noise I had been carrying since the tuition decision. It wasn't fulfillment, but it was stability. I didn't tell my family where I was staying, not out of spite, but because I didn't want their concern to reshape my choices. I had learned how quickly practical questions could turn into leverage. Distance made everything simpler. I could decide what I needed without translating it into a family narrative. Money was tight, but it was mine. I tracked every expense carefully, not out of fear, but out of control. Each small decision reinforced the same truth. Nothing I was doing depended on anyone changing their mind. That alone felt like progress. The warehouse taught me more than how to move boxes. It showed me how systems respond to pressure. When something failed, it didn't get reframed as a lesson. It got fixed or replaced. Accountability wasn't emotional, it was operational. I realized how different that was from the environment I had come from, where consequences could be deferred as long as hope remained. I began to see my family situation through that same lens. The tuition money hadn't been redirected because there were no alternatives. It had been redirected because the cost of doing so fell on me, and I was expected to absorb it quietly. In the warehouse, that kind of imbalance didn't last. Someone always noticed. At night, I planned without announcing that I was planning. I looked for ways to build skills that translated beyond one role. I paid attention to how shipments were priced, how delays affected contracts, how small inefficiencies multiplied over time. None of it felt like a grand strategy. It felt like observation, layered slowly. I didn't miss home the way I thought I would. What I missed was the version of myself that had believed effort guaranteed support. That belief had made everything else feel safer than it actually was. Losing it hurt, but it also sharpened my judgment. There were moments when I considered calling, just to clarify where things stood. Each time I stopped. I already knew. The silence wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a boundary forming on its own. By the end of my first stretch there, I wasn't thriving, but I was grounded. I had traded certainty about the future for certainty about the present. No one could move my plans without my permission anymore. For the first time since everything shifted, I wasn't waiting to see what would be decided for me next. Over time, information reached me without being invited. It arrived indirectly, through small signals that carried more weight than official updates. A delayed payment here, a supplier pulling back there. Nothing dramatic enough to be announced, but enough to suggest momentum was slipping somewhere beyond my line of sight. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need them. Patterns have a way of introducing themselves. The business my family had chosen to protect was now operating in the same industrial landscape I moved through every day. I recognized the signs before anyone explained them. Extended hours that produced less output. Equipment sitting idle behind locked doors. Temporary fixes becoming permanent routines. These weren't signs of growth. They were signs of strain. From what I could tell, the operation had expanded faster than it had learned how to sustain itself. Space had been leased before demand stabilized. Commitments had been made on optimistic timelines. Costs were treated as temporary obstacles rather than structural limits. The belief that things would eventually catch up replaced the work of making them line up. I noticed how responsibility shifted as pressure increased. Problems were framed as external. Market conditions, delays beyond control, staffing issues that would resolve themselves. Each explanation carried just enough truth to remain convincing. None of them addressed the underlying imbalance. I had seen the same logic used at home, only now it was being applied to numbers that didn't bend for sentiment. Support continued, quietly and consistently. Resources flowed in small increments, just enough to keep the doors open. Not enough to fix what was wrong, but enough to postpone reckoning. I understood that instinct. When you've invested belief as well as money, walking away feels like failure, doubling down feels like loyalty. From my position, the contrast was impossible to ignore. My days were structured around limits. If something didn't work, it stopped. If a process failed, it was replaced. There was no room for narrative, only outcomes. Watching another system resist that reality made its eventual collision feel inevitable. I never reached out. I didn't want my observations to be mistaken for judgment. Silence was safer than commentary. It allowed events to unfold without my interference, which mattered more to me than being right. I had already learned how quickly involvement could be reinterpreted as obligation. As weeks passed, the signals grew louder. Vendors tightened terms, schedules slipped. The warehouse space that had once been a symbol of progress became a liability, its costs fixed while returns fluctuated. What had looked impressive from a distance now appeared fragile up close. I thought about how easily confidence can substitute for structure in the early stages of something new. Enthusiasm creates momentum, but momentum without alignment burns fuel quickly. There was no malice in that, just miscalculation compounded by reinforcement. Every additional contribution postponed the question that needed to be answered. Meanwhile, my own routine solidified. I took on more responsibility at work, not as a favor, but as a function of consistency. Reliability earned trust here because it reduced uncertainty. There were no speeches about potential, no expectations attached to identity, only results, measured and tracked. The difference wasn't moral, it was operational. One system rewarded correction, the other rewarded persistence. I had lived inside both long enough to recognize which one absorbed mistakes and which one magnified them. When the first serious disruption occurred, it didn't arrive as a crisis. It arrived as a recalculation, a contract adjusted, a delivery postponed indefinitely. A line item that could no longer be carried forward without consequence. These moments rarely announce themselves. They simply close doors that used to open. I understood then that the choice made with my tuition hadn't just shifted my path. It had tied the family's stability to an outcome that could no longer be controlled by effort alone. Hope had been converted into exposure. I stayed where I was. I kept my focus narrow. Watching from the edges taught me more than proximity ever had. Whatever came next would arrive on its own timeline, and when it did, it wouldn't ask who deserved it. It started on a morning that looked like every other. I was halfway through my shift when my phone vibrated in my pocket. Then again. Then again. I didn't check it right away. Phones go off constantly in a warehouse. It wasn't until my break that I pulled it out and saw the screen filled with the same number, stacked one after another. Missed calls don't usually multiply like that unless something has already broken. By the end of the day, there were 36. I didn't feel panic. I felt clarity, the kind that arrives when the last uncertainty disappears. Whatever had been held together with extensions and reassurances had finally given way. The calls weren't about checking in. They weren't casual. They carried urgency, compressed into repetition. I let the phone rest on the table and finished eating. There was no calculation involved. No debate about timing. I knew exactly what answering would invite. Questions framed as concern. Requests disguised as collaboration. The expectation that I would step back into a role I had already outgrown. On the walk back to work, the screen lit up again. This time it was messages, arriving in fragments, updates without context. Statements that assumed proximity I no longer occupied. I read them once and didn't respond. Silence, I had learned, was not absence. It was a decision. That evening, the calls continued. Not evenly spaced, but clustered, as if someone was trying to compress days of avoidance into minutes. I recognized the rhythm. It mirrored the way problems had been handled before, escalating only when there was nothing left to rearrange. I thought about what those 36 attempts represented. Not just urgency, but reliance. The assumption that no matter how far I had moved, I was still within reach. That assumption hadn't been corrected yet. Avoiding the call had allowed it to survive. I went to sleep without putting the phone on silent. I wanted to see the pattern clearly. When I woke up, there were more. Fewer this time, spaced farther apart. The kind that suggests someone else had begun to think, perhaps for the first time, about alternatives. At work, nothing changed. Pallets still arrived. Inventory still needed counting. Orders still went out on schedules that didn't care who was under pressure elsewhere. That contrast grounded me. Whatever crisis was unfolding outside this routine did not extend here. My stability didn't depend on anyone else's urgency. Later, during a short break, I scrolled through the messages again. They had shifted in tone. Less information, more implication. Phrases designed to reopen conversations that had already been closed. I noticed how carefully they avoided naming the decision that started all of this, as if acknowledging it might limit what could be asked of me now. I didn't feel anger. I felt a strange detachment, like watching a system reach for a component that had already been removed. The reach itself confirmed what I had suspected all along. My absence had never been accounted for in the plan. That evening, I deleted nothing. I didn't block numbers or archive threads. I let everything remain visible, unaltered. It wasn't about keeping evidence. It was about acknowledging reality without editing it to feel better. At some point, the calls stopped. Not abruptly, but with the hesitation of someone realizing they were alone in the room. I set the phone down and went back to what I was doing. The quiet that followed wasn't peaceful, but it was honest. I understood then that the distance between us was no longer measured by miles or silence. It was measured by expectation. They still expected access. I had already revoked it. Those 36 missed calls marked the end of something that had been dissolving for months. Not the relationship itself, but the illusion that responsibility could be reassigned indefinitely. I didn't answer because there was nothing left to clarify. The situation had resolved itself into a single fact. When things worked, I was optional. When they didn't, I was essential. I chose not to return to a place where that difference wasn't acknowledged. After the calls stopped, consequences began to surface in places that couldn't be muted. They appeared first as adjustments rather than failures. Access reduced, terms tightened, timelines revised without ceremony. These were not emotional outcomes. They were administrative, the kind that arrive when flexibility has been exhausted. What had once been sustained by optimism now required documentation, compliance, and proof that no longer existed. I learned about the changes the same way I had learned about the expansion months earlier, indirectly. A notice sent to a shared address, a contract that wasn't renewed, equipment scheduled for removal. None of it came with explanations meant for me. That was the point. Explanations are only offered when influence is still expected. The warehouse space became a liability instead of a signal. Fixed costs stayed fixed while activity slowed. Storage fees accrued, regardless of intent. When output drops below threshold, patience evaporates quickly. There are no narratives strong enough to offset arithmetic. Financial pressure reorganizes priorities with ruthless efficiency. What had been framed as a temporary gap revealed itself as a structural problem. Credit lines closed. Payment plans replaced assumptions. The system demanded reconciliation, not reassurance. I recognized the sequence because I had been watching it from the other side for months. The strain extended beyond balance sheets. Reputation followed money closely, especially in environments where introductions function as collateral. Once reliability was questioned, invitations thinned, conversations shortened. Opportunities that once seemed adjacent became inaccessible. These shifts rarely announce themselves. They simply leave you out. I noticed how accountability migrated upward. Decisions once justified as necessary for growth were reclassified as miscalculations. The language changed. Words like timing and momentum were replaced by risk and exposure. That shift mattered. It marked the moment belief stopped doing the work of planning. There was an attempt to stabilize by consolidation. Less space, fewer commitments, reduced scope. But contraction without correction only slows collapse. The underlying misalignment remained untouched. When resources are added without structure, removing them doesn't restore balance. It exposes the gap. Through all of this, I remained outside the process, not excluded, irrelevant. That distinction felt important. Irrelevance meant my absence no longer distorted outcomes. Events unfolded according to their own logic, unmediated by expectation of rescue. My own situation, by contrast, continued to improve incrementally, not through sudden opportunity, but through accumulation. Hours added up, responsibilities expanded. Small efficiencies I noticed became procedures. Trust formed quietly because it was reinforced daily. No one spoke about potential. They spoke about reliability. The difference in outcomes wasn't about effort. Everyone involved was working. The difference was alignment. One system rewarded correction. The other rewarded endurance until endurance ran out. I had learned to tell them apart. There were moments when I considered intervening indirectly. not to fix anything, but to reduce collateral damage. Each time I paused, intervention would have reintroduced ambiguity about responsibility. It would have blurred the boundary that had finally become clear. Consequences only teach when they are allowed to land. As pressure increased, visibility decreased. The fewer options available, the more carefully information was controlled. Updates stopped circulating. Silence replaced transparency. That kind of quiet is not peace, it's containment. I saw how quickly narratives fracture when they can no longer be supported by results. Confidence loses authority when it stops producing outcomes. What remains is exposure: financial, professional, personal. Exposure doesn't negotiate. By the time the final adjustments were made, the situation no longer resembled a setback. It was a resolution, delivered in installments, assets redistributed, obligations reassigned. What couldn't be sustained was released. What couldn't be justified was removed. I didn't feel satisfaction watching it happen. I felt confirmation. The decision made with my tuition had bound the family's stability to a system that resisted correction. Once that system failed, there was no buffer left to absorb impact. I stayed where I was and continued doing what I had been doing. The work didn't change, the routine didn't shift. That constancy mattered. It meant my future was no longer contingent on someone else's recovery. The aftermath clarified something I had struggled to articulate before. Support that requires silence is not support. Investment that ignores structure is not opportunity. And responsibility that only flows in one direction eventually breaks the person carrying it. When everything settled, what remained was simple. I had removed myself from a system that demanded flexibility without offering protection. What collapsed did so on its own terms, without my participation. That separation was not an act of punishment. It was an acknowledgement of reality, finally applied without exception. After everything settled, distance stopped feeling temporary. It wasn't created by silence alone, but by the absence of expectation. No more waiting for updates. No more checking my phone out of habit. The space between us became stable, not because it was maintained, but because nothing crossed it anymore. That was how I knew it was real. I didn't return to explain myself. I didn't outline my reasons or revisit old decisions. There was nothing left to clarify. The outcome had already delivered its explanation, more clearly than any conversation could have. When choices are made without you, the results don't require your approval to stand. My life continued to narrow and strengthen at the same time. Fewer dependencies, clearer priorities. I built routines that didn't rely on forgiveness or flexibility from anyone else. Work became predictable in the best way. Effort led to outcomes. Accountability moved in both directions. I no longer had to wonder where I stood. Occasionally, information surfaced that confirmed the separation was permanent. Not updates meant to reconnect, but residual echoes of a system adjusting to loss. Those moments didn't pull me back. They reinforced the boundary. I understood then that closure doesn't always come from resolution. Sometimes it comes from alignment. I thought about what I had believed growing up, that responsibility would be recognized and protected, that being dependable meant being valued. It took losing something significant to see the flaw in that logic. Dependability without limits becomes permission, and permission, once granted, is rarely returned voluntarily. Walking away had not been an act of anger. It had been an act of accuracy. I had measured what was being asked of me against what was being offered and found the equation unsustainable. Leaving corrected that imbalance, not by fixing it, but by removing myself from it entirely. I don't tell this story to frame myself as strong or unbreakable. I wasn't. I adjusted because I had to. What changed wasn't my capacity, but my criteria. I stopped evaluating decisions based on who needed me and started evaluating them based on whether they protected what I was building. The hardest part wasn't the loss of support, it was the loss of assumption. The belief that effort guaranteed safety had shaped many of my choices. Letting go of it forced me to become more deliberate, less sentimental, and more honest about what systems I was willing to participate in. If there is a lesson here, it isn't about cutting people off quickly or proving independence at any cost. It's about recognizing patterns before they define you. It's about understanding that love, responsibility, and obligation are not interchangeable. When they're treated as such, someone always absorbs the difference. I learned that stability built on clarity lasts longer than stability built on hope, that boundaries don't need to be dramatic to be effective, and that walking away doesn't always mean you're giving up. Sometimes it means you're choosing a future that doesn't require permission to exist. Today, my life is quieter than it used to be. Fewer voices, less noise. But it's also more consistent. Nothing I rely on depends on someone else changing their mind. That, to me, is worth more than reconciliation that comes too late to matter. I don't expect everyone to agree with the choice I made. I only know that staying would have required me to keep shrinking. Leaving allowed me to grow into something solid enough to stand on its own. If you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of your own situation in it, take that seriously. Patterns don't announce themselves as warnings. They reveal themselves through repetition. Paying attention early can save you years of negotiation later. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my story. If it made you reflect on a choice you're facing or a boundary you've been avoiding, that reflection matters. Let me know what stood out to you and where you're listening from. I appreciate you being here.